Long
I'm doing
time.
just fine. Good to be here.
Yeah, and it's always good to talk to you. And we had a chance. I was just saying we don't talk to you enough, man. But I appreciate the work you've been doing for years with the sentencing project. Um,
Thanks so much.
One of the issues, obviously, that we're dealing with is felony disenfranchisement.
Mhm.
But there have been reforms in that. You've led a lot of that. They've been successful. It's on the ballot right now in Florida, isn't it?
That's right. That's right. Florida is really the sort of epicenter of the impact of felony disenfranchisement, where you lose your right to vote when you get a felony conviction. And the laws are different in every state in terms of the duration of that exclusion. But in Florida and three other states, not only do you lose your right to vote while you're in prison or on probation or parole, but actually for the rest of your life unless you can get a pardon from the governor. And so there's a ballot proposal that, if it's adopted by the voters, could reenfranchise as many as 1.4 million people who
Mm-hmm.
have past felony convictions that are long since completed.
Okay, all right. That's important, and I mean, in a state like Florida, that's going to make a really big difference, isn't it?
Well, it certainly is. If you just look at the numbers, we can remember back to the historic presidential election in the year 2000, where we decided a national election based on a difference of 537 votes in the state of Florida. Even if just a modest proportion of these 1.4 million people vote, that's an enormous impact on the electorate moving forward.
Is this happening anywhere else? Is this on the ballot anywhere else in the country? This
It's
November.
not on the ballot right now, no, but there have been, many changes over the last 20 years or so, either through legislatures or governors taking action to reenfranchise people.
Right, because that they've been doing it on their own. I know there was what was the most recent success? I think was it in Maryland.
Maryland is the yeah Maryland over the last several years extended voting rights to people on probation and parole. The governor then vetoed that measure, but the legislature came back and overrode that veto. So about an estimated 40,000 people now regain the right to vote. And just earlier this year, in New York State, where people can vote either in prison or on parole, Governor Cuomo, through executive order, re-enfranchised everyone on parole supervision, about 35,000 people. And, the rationale there was these are people who have been released to the community. They're expected to be working, to pay taxes, take care of their children. We shouldn't be treating them as second-class citizens still.
Yeah. So now, if in some of these states, I mean, it's sort of a, a lot of different states do it differently, don't they? Each state kind of has their own way of applying this, don't they?
They do, and I mean, basically in 48 states, you lose your right to vote while you're in prison. 34 of those states, you also can't vote if you're on probation or parole. 12 states, it may carry over after you complete your sentence, and as I mentioned, 4 states, including Florida, it's a lifetime ban on voting. And we can point out that there are 2 states, Maine and Vermont, that don't have any felony disenfranchisement. So if you get a felony conviction, you're going to get punished for that, but they don't take away your fundamental rights of citizenship. So even people in prison are able to vote by absentee ballot in those states.
In an ideal world, you would not, from the sentencing project's point of view, you would not be disenfranchised at all, right, Mark?
That's what I think. This is, when you're convicted of a crime, you don't stop being a citizen of the country. So you could be in a maximum security prison cell. You still have the right to get married or divorced. You can buy or sell property. You have most of your free speech rights. You can write a letter to the editor of the New York Times, and you might get it published even though you're sitting in prison, because we generally recognize that the punishment for the crime, again, does not mean you're not a citizen and the Constitution doesn't apply to you. That's a completely separate issue, what that punishment looks like.
I as I've shared with you before, when I was in South Africa in 1994,
Mm-hmm.
Part of what I did, part of my activity there, was registering voters who were incarcerated. We went into the prisons
Mm-hmm.
and registered voters because there were voting booths in prison. You could vote in prison
Mm-hmm.
in South Africa. And having had that experience, coming
Mm-hmm.
back here, I'm like, well, what are we doing over here?
Right, right. Well, and it's not only South Africa and many industrialized nations. That's exactly the policy. If you look at Western Europe, Canada, some of those nations disenfranchise people while they're in prison, but it's solely limited to prison. Many of them allow voting in prison as well, and there have been decisions by constitutional courts in Canada, South Africa, Israel, the European Court of Human Rights, all upholding the right to vote in prison, saying this is a separate issue than punishment for your crime.
So why do we do it here? Why do we allow that to happen here?
Well, I think it goes back really to the founding of this country when disenfranchisement was incorporated. It was a leftover from the colonial period.
Mm-hmm.
And we remember this country was founded as an experiment democracy, but of course it was a very limited experiment at the time. So essentially a group of wealthy white male property holders granted themselves the right to vote. Women couldn't vote, African Americans, illiterate people, poor people, and also people with felony convictions. And
Mm-hmm.
over the course of 2 centuries, we've done away with all those other prohibitions. We now look back at them with a great deal of embarrassment, and yet the prohibition on people with felony convictions is the sole remaining block to really full democracy, and is now affecting a record 6 million people who won't be voting in the November elections this year.
So, but progress is being made. I mean, we can look from the 23 states that have already enacted, and some of those states have further to go.
Exactly. No, we've been encouraged. 2 decades is a relatively short period of time, and a new report we just released shows that 23 states have enacted some type of change. You see changes states like New Mexico, which did away with its ban on post-sentence voting once you complete your sentence. Connecticut, Rhode Island, extending voting rights to people on probation or parole. We have governors. I mentioned Governor Cuomo, Governor Terry McAuliffe, when he was in Virginia just a few years ago. Virginia's another one of those lifetime ban states. Governor McAuliffe pointed to the very clear racist history of how those policies were adopted.
Right.
And so with a stroke of a pen, he granted the right to vote to 173,000 people who had long ago completed their felony sentences but were still disenfranchised. So we've seen some pretty dramatic shifts in a good number of states around the country.
No, this is important and great news. 23 states have restored voting rights to 1.4 million people, ladies and gentlemen, but there are still 6 million that are disenfranchised. So let's deal with some of these battlegrounds, though.
Mm-hmm.
So now in Florida, the clemency process has been simplified. We know that.
Mm-hmm.
But what is on the ballot in 2 weeks is it full restoration?
Yeah, well, what it is, right now the problem is the disenfranchisement is embedded in the state constitution, and while the advocacy community has tried for many years to get the legislature to put a repeal on the Constitution, that hasn't been successful in the Florida legislature. So now They've gathered more than 1 million signatures to get, it's called Amendment 4 on the ballot, and basically says anyone who's completed their sentence, with the exception of a conviction either for murder or sex offense, but any other person with a felony is completed, it'll be automatic restoration. So either the day you leave prison or the day you get off probation or parole, whichever is the case, automatic rights of restoration. You can go down and register just like any other citizen could.
Okay. So, in terms of some of these other battleground states, as I'm looking, let's take a state like, well, first let's look at Nevada. How has Nevada reformed? What's their status?
Well, they had some prohibitions against post-sentence disenfranchisement. Certain people couldn't vote after completing sentence and did away with that. What we see also in some of these states, there are really two parts to it, to making a change. And one, of course, is changing the law, the underlying policy. But the other is really public education, getting the word out, because there's so much misinformation about these policies, and because it varies by state, that even when the law changes, many people who would be positively affected don't necessarily know about it. And that's why in a good number of states there have been campaigns on the ground to do the outreach and the voter registration following the shift from the governor or the legislature also.
I see. So Nevada's made some changes. They've repealed the 5-year waiting period, restored voting rights to persons convicted of first-time nonviolent offenses, restored voting rights to people dishonestly discharged from probation or parole, allow people convicted of Category B offenses to have their rights restored after a 2-year waiting period.
Right.
I do not see. We just had a guest on from Tennessee. Tennessee in 2006 streamlined restoration process for most persons upon completion of sentence.
Yes.
So
Tennessee is a good example. Tennessee, until relatively recently, had 4 different laws that govern rights restoration, and so it depended on the year in which you got your felony conviction. So, there was one if you convicted between 1981 and 1984, you were subject to one law. If it was 84 to 89 or something like that, it was a different law. I mean, very seasoned lawyers had difficulty trying to tell their clients what applied to them, and we can only imagine what it was like for people who don't have a law degree to try to figure out what that meant for them.
Texas, what's the deal in Texas?
Well, Texas is interesting. 30 years ago, they had a 5-year ban on voting after you completed your sentence. In the 1980s, that was reduced to 2 years after sentence. And finally, in 1997, the legislature eliminated the 2-year waiting period after you completed your sentence. Interestingly, that change was signed into law by then Governor George W. Bush. And, we've seen this in a number of states around the country. It's been both Democratic and Republican governors, in many cases, signing these laws into being. And, the reason that was important in Texas, the 2-year waiting period, most of us have a hard enough time figuring out what we're supposed to be doing next week, let alone 2 years from now. And so people completed their sentence, get along with their lives in the community. Many people just, didn't know exactly when they could go and register to vote. So now you finish your sentence, the next day you can go down and register. It's a much simplified process. It makes sense for everybody all around.
That's good news for Texas. What about Arizona? I don't see Arizona on your list. Is that?
Arizona hasn't made much change. In Arizona, as I said, every state is unique. So in Arizona, if you have a single felony conviction, you get the right restored when you complete your sentence. But if you have a second felony conviction, you don't get your rights restored. The political logic behind these is sometimes pretty difficult to untangle, but again, that's what makes it so complicated.
And we know it's subjective as well. What about Georgia?
Georgia is it's you can't vote in prison or on probation or parole, but you get your rights restored when you complete your sentence. And in some ways that sounds better. It's not a lifetime ban or anything, but if you look in the criminal justice system, the number of people on probation is far larger than the number of people in prison. So states that disenfranchise people on probation have a much higher impact on what those outcomes look like, too.
Is there any state, Marc Maurer, the Sentencing Project, folks, 26 minutes past the hour, sentencingproject.org. Is there any state, Marc, where one may vote while incarcerated in the United States?
Well, two states, Maine and Vermont, allow
Okay.
that, and the way they do it is they get an absentee ballot. It's similar to a college student being in a state not at home. They register for an absentee ballot, send that in. Their ballot counts along with everyone else. So in Maine, if you're from Portland, Maine, but you're housed in a prison in rural Maine, you get an absentee ballot. It goes to the Portland elections authorities, and your vote gets counted that way. It's a very simple process. They haven't experienced any problems with the bureaucracy of making it work, and it just sends a message that yes, you're in prison, but you're still a member of this broader community.
Marc Maurer of the sentencingproject.org, folks, for you to be fully aware and informed. And maybe there's those in your states where you want to bring about change and maybe so inspired like people in Florida are doing. They put it on the ballot. You would encourage that, wouldn't you, Marc, for citizens to try to get ballot initiatives to change some of this, right?
Yeah. Sometimes it's going to be through a ballot initiative, although those are difficult and expensive. Frequently, it's going to be through change in the legislature and sometimes with the governor. So it depends on, building a coalition and seeing what the pressure points look like.
Yeah. All right. Marc, it's always good to talk to you. Congratulations on your work. Sentencing Project has led the way in a lot of these reforms and has been a clearinghouse, not only when it comes to felony disenfranchisement, other sentencing issues, sentencing disparities. Sentencingproject.org does great work, and my friend Marc Maurer has been at it for years, and we appreciate and admire him for that. Marc,
well, thanks so much, and it's always great to be here, too.
Yeah, man. Let's talk more often, okay, buddy?
We'll do that.
All right. Thank
Take
you,
care.
Marc. Take care now. All right, 866